Hey everyone. We're going to go ahead and rank the Sega Genesis Wrestling games now. I had originally wanted to include two Japanese games that were only on the Mega Drive, but I couldn't get them to work. So let's go over the five that I was able to actually get running on the Sega Genesis. This is the game that sent me down a rabbit hole to find out what Flying Edge was and why Acclaim used them instead of LJN. That's the most notable thing from this game. It gave me an idea for a completely different project. And yeah, that's pretty much it. It isn't a great game, but Super WrestleMania is just kind of an average game that doesn't look as good as the SNES version. It does control somewhat okay, and has a few different wrestlers on the roster from the Super Nintendo version, but the graphics are a little bit worse, and I still hate the tug-of-war control scheme. This is the worst wrestling game on the Sega Genesis, but it isn't terrible. Like, there's no WCW Super Brawl on here. It's fine for what it is. I would just rather be playing something else. WWF Royal Rumble is a little bit better than Super WrestleMania. Not by much, though. It has the same awful control scheme that I didn't like. The graphics have gotten better, but the controls seem to have gotten a little worse in this one. And for some odd reason, the difficulty setting got replaced with a 1 to 10 scale that just confused the living hell out of me. The first thing that I noticed was how the developers had improved the graphics. They look a lot better than they did on Super WrestleMania. And the sprites are just more detailed, and things don't look as off as they did with the previous game. For whatever reason, I felt Royal Rumble was a little bit easier than Super WrestleMania, but that's not really saying a whole lot. Playing this game was fun. I did like the differences between this version and the Super Nintendo, even though they were mostly with the roster. I actually liked the Genesis version of WWF Raw better than the Super Nintendo version, for whatever reason. I do like that they have a pretty decent selection of wrestlers on here, and I like the fact that there were so many game modes. The only thing that I liked better about this game was just it was easier to play than the Super Nintendo version. However, it's still saddled with this awful button-mashing tug-of-war control scheme, and I'm glad that I don't have to bring this up anymore or talk about it, because I'm sure everyone's kind of sick of it at this point. I wouldn't say I liked any of these three games, but of the three, this one was probably the best. If I had played this back in the 90s, I might have liked it a little bit more, but playing it for this one, no, I just really did not like it. WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game on the Sega Genesis, is a little bit better than the Super Nintendo one. It's got a bigger roster, but that's not really saying a whole lot, because it's just, 8 instead of 6. And I think the Genesis looks a little bit better than the Super Nintendo one. There aren't really big differences between the two versions, it's just a bunch of smaller things. But those smaller things help to elevate this one above the other three WWF games on the system. Even though there are only 2 game modes, you can play with another player, so that kind of makes things a little bit better. And even though it does get a little bit repetitive, there's an awful lot of challenge in this game. So you have these pretty easy controls, but you have a fairly challenging game. Of the 4 WWF games on the Sega Genesis, this one was my favorite. I also think it's the best out of those 4. I like the arcade games just a lot more than the simulation games. The 2 arcade games on the Sega Genesis try to be more like fighting games, and that kind of works out a lot better than trying to be a simulation, but not having any of the features that you would have on the PlayStation games. Well, just like the ranking list I did for the Super Nintendo games, I like Saturday Night Slam Masters better than all of the wrestling games on the Sega Genesis. Funny how that works out, huh? The Sega Genesis does have a limited number of wrestling games, so there wasn't a whole lot of competition for this one, and there wasn't like a Hammerlock Wrestling or a NCW Wrestling like there was, over on the Super Nintendo. And if I had gotten those two Mega Drive games to work, it might not have been the best game on the system. However, this is an excellent port of an arcade game. The controls are simple, the graphics are much better than the previous games on this list. While it doesn't have as many game modes as some of the WWF games, and it's closer to WrestleMania the arcade game, it still has much better gameplay than the three WWF games that were, not arcade games. Saturday Night Slam Masters is a simple arcade game with over-the-top wrestlers. It's closer to what a fighting game would be, and it's the best wrestling game on the Sega Genesis. I was a little shocked to see how few wrestling games there really were on this console. This is why I kind of wanted to bring in the Mega Drive exclusive games, but I just could not get them to work. I knew what I was getting into with these games, at least, because they were all on this list of the Super Nintendo games, so yeah, I didn't have to worry too much about trying to figure out the control schemes or anything like that. I felt like I was better prepared to play these games than when I tried them out on the Super Nintendo, and some of my opinions on them have changed a little bit just because I got more familiar with how those games are supposed to be played. I still don't like the gameplay, but at least I knew what I was getting into. What was weird for me is just the lack of like a WCW game on the Sega Genesis. They were able to reskin a game for the Nintendo and release Super Brawl for the SNES, but there wasn't one for the Sega Genesis. I know that they had planned a port of Super Brawl, but that one got canceled for whatever reason. Based on some of the older video game magazines I was able to look at that were thankfully archived, the Super Brawl game was planned, but it was never released, so I don't know how far they got with their port, and that knowledge is probably just lost to time. That is a story I might want to look into at some point, but yeah, I wouldn't hold your breath on that one. The next console I'm going to look at is the PS1, so there are a lot more wrestling games on that one, and I think they're all a lot better than what you would see on the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. So I will talk to you guys later. Bye.